Hello and welcome. Let's see, we have people logging in here. We're so glad to have you join us today. This is a Zoom webinar, so cameras and microphones are turned off for the audience. We invite you to interact with us and other attendees by using the chat box. Just make sure that you set that to send to all panelists and attendees so we can see your comments there. And then you'll be able to submit questions to the panel using the Q&A feature in the bottom of your screen. So I want to invite you to go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat box. Let us know who you are and where you're joining from today. Also, for accessibility, we have closed captioning embedded in this session. You could turn that on using the feature on the bottom of your screen. So thank you again for tuning in to today's webinar presented by Move United. Today's panel discussion is designed to round out our Yoga and Disability webinar series we hosted this month with support from the US Department of Veterans Affairs. My name is Julianne Mills and I'll be your host today. I'm a program manager at Move United, and this year I've been proud to work in expanding access to yoga in the Move United membership network and beyond through training events and equipment grants. You can learn more about this work at moveunitedsport.org/yoga training. Today we're joined by a group of panelists, and before I introduce them, I want to briefly cover a few housekeeping items now that we have everyone logged in. Again, this is a webinar, so your cameras and microphones are turned off. You can download the panelist biographies at moveunitedsport.org/meetthepanelists. We'll be pasting that link in the chat box for you to download that. You can use the questions box to submit your questions. And you can find this webinar. It will be recorded and posted on YouTube tomorrow. You'll also be receiving a follow-up email tomorrow with that link and other resources that are mentioned in today's discussion. So the purpose of today's panel discussion will be to challenge this misconception that yoga is only for certain people, that perhaps it takes a particular body, ability, socioeconomic status, and other factors to access yoga. Today's panel will be discussing ways that we can make yoga more equitable and accessible for people of all abilities, shapes, sizes, ages, races, genders, ethnicities, life circumstances, and experiences. The list goes on. I think the message is clear that yoga is for everybody, but in order for everybody to see that, it takes this level of sharing and taking action in order to make it more inclusive. In particular, we'll be highlighting the personal experiences of our panelists to illustrate how we can think beyond this idea that yoga for people with disabilities has to be adaptive yoga, when by its very nature, we know that yoga is inclusive. And it's so much more than the physical shape of the poses. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists who you can learn more about on that webinar handout and invite them each to tell us a little bit more about their yoga experience and how they got started. And perhaps if you remember your first class, you could tell us about that. So first, I'm going to turn things over to Amy Burnett, who I will refer to as Amy B today. She is a T4 complete paraplegic and a member of the USA Para Badminton team. She is also a singer, musician, and spends most of the year in an RV traveling with her dog and fiance.
Hi, everybody. First off, I just want to thank everybody for inviting me here at Move United. What a great opportunity to talk about something that has absolutely just been so sweet and dear to my life. Yes, I do play badminton for Team USA, and it's a highly competitive sport, so it's super nice to have something like adaptive yoga where you get to go in You're not judged on what you can and can't do. There's no competition level whatsoever. You can go in and literally work on making yourself better from the inside out, and better not as in, physically better, but a lot of times it's just breathing, simple things that make you feel really great and awesome, because you truly, really are. My first yoga class was a hot yoga class. And as a T4 para, those of you who know anything about high-level paras, we freeze all the time. So a great able-bodied friend of mine said, you know what, I'm going to go to this hot yoga class. I think you'd really love it. And I thought, you had me at hot. I don't even care where we're going, but it's cold. It's Arizona right now, and it was cold. And I thought, yeah, I'll go. I slipped, I fell, I landed in what they wanted to call the broken pigeon pose. But everybody there was just all hands-on and nice and helpful. It wasn't an adaptive yoga class. My friend is, an able-bodied person. But just going and having so many people just reach out and want to be so kind and generous and helpful, and really want to just help me learn to do something that I'd never experienced before. I just learned really quickly that being in an environment where there was nothing but positivity was going to do nothing but help me. I never felt like, oh, I can't do this. They're doing something I can't do. There was always somebody in the room. Every time I'm ever gone, there's always somebody there that goes, if you try this a little bit differently, that might work for you. Because I know that you can't stand, and so you can't do some of these poses, but let's try to make it adaptive. And so I didn't even know there was such a thing until a couple of years ago of adaptive yoga. I just have been going to yoga classes with the general population for years and trying to figure out what works, and I'm enjoying it immensely. So thank you for having me here.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And I think that the social support, from your friend, but also from, others in the class, that's really key to making people feel welcome in a role that everyone can play, and inclusion. Next, I want to introduce Keith Gabel. He is a below-knee amputee and two-time US Paralympic medalist in snowboarding. He also works to get disabled veterans involved in sport through his work at Team Semper Fi.
Hey everyone, like Amy said, thank you so much for having me. I think that this is so important for not only athletes, but everyone out there to just kind of learn a little bit more and maybe understand that, yoga and mindfulness practice or meditation is one of those things that everybody can benefit from. I started really working on my yoga practice and my mindfulness practice shortly after my performance in Sochi. Things were great, but they also weren't quite where I wanted them to be. And learning that about myself, having conversations with my coaches, mentors, and what have you, they kind of pointed out one of my big faults, which is, at times you can be your best friend, or you can be your worst enemy. And that a lot of that came from, excuse me, a lot of that came from previous traumas and things that I kind of held on to that really I didn't have a lot of control of. If it happens in the past, you can't change the past, and you can only kind of look forward to the future and work on yourself to be better at being proactive versus reactive. And I think my first actual yoga class, I believe we were in a team setting at a team camp in Austria, and one of our coaches was also a yoga instructor, and he said, we're going to do a yoga class. And I mean, I struggled. I couldn't get into really any of the poses. I got really frustrated with it, and I was like, oh, this is dumb. Like, this isn't for me. And so I kind of ran with that narrative for a little while until that conversation took place. And something that I realized was I was kind of holding on to this preconceived notion that we'll use the word meditation. I mean, it has somewhat of a stigma to it. And you think, oh, that's for you know, people that are Buddhist, or that's for people that are like Hindu or something like that. And so I kind of associated it with a religion, and that instantly kind of pushed me the other direction until I tried it a few times. I didn't really get the results that I wanted. And so I pushed even harder against it. And then my mentor sat down with me and he said, listen, you know, the way a good approach for this is to try it for a couple of weeks and then see how you're feeling. And while you're trying that, practice some non-judgment with it. Don't think about it as a religion. Don't think of it as anything more than just a practice. And once I kind of went into it with that mindset, I realized, hey, you know, I'm actually starting to slightly see positive results. And for me, I'm a restless guy. I'm one of those people that's always on the move, tons of energy. And again, I can be my best friend or my worst enemy. So going into a competition with too much energy, what we do is very dangerous. I'm a snowboarder. We race down a course with multiple other people, and you know, we're going over every feature that you can see on a mountain, but with two to three other people next to you. And if your mindset isn't right, you can definitely hurt yourself, hurt someone else, even die. And so really what we started to focus on was kind of calming me down before competition. And then if I didn't have the results that I had really expected, it wasn't necessarily like, okay, you can't think about that, but more or less giving me a little bit of time to kind of work my way through it, setting a limit as far as how much time I have to be disappointed with myself, work on a few things that I noticed that I could have done better, and then move forward with it, let it go, because otherwise it would just sit there and eat at me, and my attitude would be not the greatest for days on end. And I really saw a lot of success with that, especially in the Pyeongchang games. You know, the hype was there for us, you know, being a relatively new sport, a very exciting sport. We had cameras on us the whole time. People wanted autographs, photos, that kind of stuff. And you really do see it with some of the athletes that have taken the time to really build their body and build that muscle memory, but not take the time to work on their mental space, their awareness of their self, and really handle that kind of pressure. And it's crazy. You see some of the best athletes in the world fold under that pressure. And I really attribute some of my success in snowboarding in general, but a lot of my success in Pyeongchang was I was able to calm myself down and get rid of that negative energy of focusing on the wrong things and really just focus on getting to that gold medal round.
Yeah, that's a great great way to demonstrate very tangibly what some of those benefits of yoga are. And I like how you point out it isn't for me, because so many people have that same experience where your first contact may not be positive. So I think that realization or trying again or trying something different is really important, and we're going to talk more about that today. Next, I want to introduce John Gillard. He is a Navy veteran and yoga teacher. He also enjoys skiing and swimming and teaches swimming to children with disabilities. So I'm going to turn it to you, John, to talk a little bit more about your experience in yoga and maybe what led you to take the plunge to becoming a yoga teacher.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Can you hear me okay, Julian? Okay. All right, my name is John Gillard. I actually work for the Department of Veteran Affairs as well. I work in Bedford. My first yoga class I took one. I don't think I remember it. I don't remember it too well. I was in the Navy years ago, and I did a lot of sports, martial arts, swam, ran, and I read an article piggybacking on what Keith said. I didn't think yoga was for me. This is not something that I grew up even being able to relate to. This is something that I also attributed to or related to religion, and it never appealed to me. I read an article about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and how he played for UCLA, sprained his ankles all the time. He started taking yoga. He played in the NBA for 19 years. He never sprained his ankle again, and he attributed to yoga. So that sold me, just being injury-free or being able to minimize my healing time. But then it got deeper for me. Being a combat veteran, I was a Navy corpsman. I served with the Marines out in California, Camp Pendleton, and I was deployed with them as well. And the practice really got deeper for me. So my first class where it was deeper, it was beyond the physical, was probably 2010, 2009. And I had an amazing instructor, and he shared the history, and it just took the stigma away. He took the stigma away by educating me about the very definition of yoga. The very definition of yoga is the union of opposites. It's the union of opposites. So being introduced to something that I don't believe is for me, trying it and realizing that there's a lot more, I have a lot more in common with the practice than not. So that's what appealed to me. And I've been teaching since 2013. I've been an ambassador for the Veterans Yoga Project. I also teach, I've taught a couple Project Odysseys with Wounded Warrior. And it's a very authentic practice. It's, I've done, like I said, I've done martial arts, I've ran, swam, ski. I enjoy all of those things, but yoga is something that is very unique in that it is challenging, but it also centers me. It relaxes me, and that's much more challenging than swimming in some regards, swimming or running or lifting weights. So that's my story, and I'm sticking with it.
I like the point you mentioned it. It reminded me of, we had Matthew Sanford lead our webinar last week on yoga and athletic performance. And he talked very specifically about finding your feet and finding your feet even if you can't feel them, you know, in the traditional sense. So definitely you would enjoy that bit. You want to look back at last week's webinar. Let's see, and I'm going to turn it now to Alison Whitehead. She is the acting director at the VA Integrative Health Coordinating Center, where she leads the development of programs and policies for integrative health implementation across VA. In addition, she is a yoga instructor, a personal trainer, and a yoga therapist in training. So Alison, I'm going to turn it to you to talk a little bit more about your yoga experience and maybe decode this integrative health work that you do at the VA for our general audience.
Sure, yeah, so I'll go a little bit into how I came to yoga first, and everything that the other amazing panelists have said has really resonated with me. I grew up being very active, playing sports competitively, you know, all through college, soccer, running, etc. So I was always into sort of intense sports, intense physical activity. And to me, I thought yoga was just stretching. And, you know, I kind of did stretching already with my sport, so it didn't seem like something that I necessarily needed. And the first time I went to a class with a friend, I sort of love to reflect on this, because the first time I went to a class, you know, I did all the poses, that all seemed fine. And then we get to the end and we're just supposed to lay there and not do anything, and everybody else is just laying there and not doing anything. And that to me just seemed so strange. And it was very strange to me, but now that's absolutely like my favorite part. Like I love restorative yoga, gentle yoga. a class that's maybe just breathing and meditation. So that's just kind of funny when I think back of, you know, my first experience and what I thought I didn't like or what I thought was strange. When I started working with the VA in 2010 with the Women's Health Services Office, it was located in Washington, D.C., and I had colleagues there that were working at the Washington, D.C. VA teaching yoga to veterans, and I was able to, you know, go to a couple of those classes and see what that was all about, and that was just so, it just floored me to see the impact that yoga had on veterans, and that is truly what inspired me to kind of give it another try, take some more classes, and then ultimately have the goal of becoming a yoga teacher so I could hopefully give back and provide yoga to veterans at the VA. And so that's when I took my first teacher training, I think back in about 2012 or 13. And during that time, you know, in my first teacher training program, I didn't feel like there was a whole lot of information around, you know, adaptive yoga or yoga for injury and things like that. And having grown up as an athlete, having known my yoga practice to help, John, as you were saying, with injury prevention and things like that, I just kind of wanted more. So that's what led me to pursue some additional training and look into yoga therapy. What I do for the VA right now is in 2015, I switched from the Women's Health Office to the Integrative Health Coordinating Center, which is a mouthful, that sits within the VHA Office of Patient-Centered Care and Cultural Transformation, which is also a really long name for an office. But essentially what we're doing is really trying to transform healthcare in the VA and hopefully outside of VA. We are moving towards a whole health system model of care in VA that some of you may have heard bits and pieces about, where we're really sort of moving away from that episodic, you know, sick-based care, looking at the whole individual and incorporating these different self-care components, different integrative health modalities such as yoga, tai chi, meditation, acupuncture, health coaching as a part of this larger system of care. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but I feel like I've said a lot, and I know we still have another Amy to go here as a panelist, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions for the other panelists as well. So thank you.
Great, yeah, thank you for being here, Allison. And I liked the observation that you shared, how over the course of your practice, whether, you know, whatever span of time that may be, your feelings on things can change. So again, lends itself to Keith saying, hey, this isn't for me. You may feel that about particular parts, and it all changes and evolves over time. It's part of the practice. So thank you for sharing that insight. And last but not least, we have Amy Samson-Burke joining us. She is a physical therapist and yoga therapist, also the director of programs for Mind Body Solutions, who Move United has been working with to deliver yoga training this year. And if you've tuned into our webinars throughout this series in June, you may recognize her from several of those. So Amy, you can introduce yourself and tell us, do you remember your first yoga class?
My first yoga class, it was about 20 years ago, and I had 2 small children at the time, and I was a practicing physical therapist, so I was a busy mom, a busy physical therapist, yada, yada, yada. Anyway, I thought, you know, I should give this yoga a try because I'm really stressed out. So I went to a yoga class on the advice of a friend, chose a teacher, and I found out during my course of my first few yoga classes that it was the one thing where I could almost completely remove myself from everything else that was going on in my life and just really focus. And I found that it honed my focus, and it provided a sense of calm and a sense of energy that I was lacking in other parts of my life. And boy, I was hooked, and I've been a practitioner ever since. The more I practiced yoga, the more I thought that this should be in healthcare. And 20 or 18 or so years ago, that was a little out there. I was considered a little bit of an outlier. But I started working in home care a few years later, and nobody was watching, quite frankly. So I started practicing yoga with my physical therapy clients as part of their physical therapy program, and they loved it. And they enjoyed a break from the more traditional practices. It allowed them to be more engaged in their health. It helped with what we call exercise compliance. I mean, they wanted to keep doing that. But the interesting thing was that I found that it helped me too as a healthcare provider. And so it suddenly, I was realizing that it was serving both of us. And so really my focus over the past 15 years, I partnered with Mind Body Solutions, and I've gradually become more active with Mind Body Solutions and a little less active in the physical therapy world. And bringing these practices into healthcare was a huge, which is a huge passion of mine. So I love sharing yoga with people of all abilities. That is our focus at Mind Body Solutions. We train people with trauma, loss, and disability all across the arc of life and the spectrum of ability. And then the other part, like I said, that I'm so passionate about is bringing yoga into healthcare. And so this whole health initiative with the VA has been really what I think I've been working for a long, long time, is to not only provide yoga teachings to people living with disability, but also provide yoga teachings to those who are caring for them, professional caregivers or personal caregivers, so we can start to make this go viral and have it be part of the air that we breathe in healthcare, whether it's yoga or Tai Chi or whatever mind-body practices that you use. Start helping people tap into a deeper level of listening and a deeper level of subtleness in the body. And just like Keith was saying, it helped him find his feet when he was snowboarding. It helps you in all sorts of ways that maybe you don't even realize when you look at it just from the first level. So I could go on and on, but I will stop there.
No, and that's a really good point when you share that example of how it helped you work better to have your own practice. And that's something that we've been trying to instill throughout the webinar series and also our trainings. And I know we have a number of healthcare providers on the webinar today that want to learn more about that. So I am going to launch a poll for the audience to tell us a little bit more about themselves. This will help us gear our discussion accordingly today. So you can check all that apply to indicate if you are a person with a disability, a yoga teacher, a healthcare provider, or a sport and rec provider. So that's to include coaches and instructors for different sports and activities. So I'll give you a few more seconds to answer that. And it looks like the majority of the audience today are healthcare providers, sport and rec providers. We also have about a third of the audience are yoga teachers, and maybe about 15% of the audience has a disability. All right, thank you for voting. And that. So next, I want to dive into a couple of questions that are specific to a yoga practice for a person with a physical disability. And these were submitted in advance, and I would love to hear from you if your personal experience in your practice lends itself to these questions, or if you are a yoga teacher that may have some insight, feel free to chime in here. So the first question is regarding different forms of yoga, so different styles. They're not all the same. So do any of you have opinions on whether certain forms of yoga lend themselves to being more adaptable or suitable for leading an inclusive yoga practice?
I'd be happy to weigh in that. The yoga that we teach is based on the principles of Iyengar yoga, and one of the reasons we do that is because there are so many different props used in Iyengar yoga. So that allows people to have a full manifestation of the pose, both on the outer body, but also on the inner body, by the use of simple concepts of bringing people toward the midline, maybe using a block or a strap around their legs to help them feel that sensation of boundary. So I have found personally that that's been a good style, if you will, of yoga to help people of all abilities access the yoga. And then also there's attention to detail in that style of yoga that I think helps us all tap into that inner body sensation of what's going on in the pose, focusing a little less on the outer body manifestation or the outer body performance of the pose, and recognizing some of the sensations that are associated with the poses on the inner body.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point, and one that I wanted to emphasize on today's discussion about thinking about yoga beyond the shape of the pose, right? So, flexibility and athleticism doesn't need to be a prerequisite for yoga. And can anyone else chime in regarding other mind-body practices, or maybe something like yoga nidra, or other things you've experienced or you have experience leading?
Yeah, I was gonna say, yoga nidra, breathing practices, meditation. I think sometimes people think about yoga as these intense physical poses, and I think so much of what yoga has to offer, a lot of the tools, in yoga therapy, it really is that going internal, the breathing practices, the meditation, the yoga nidras, and then in addition, I totally agree with everything that Amy was saying about styles and things to consider. I also think that the training of a teacher or an instructor or a therapist can be really important, because I think a lot of classes can be, yoga is adaptable, right? It is something that we can all do and find our version of it. I think sometimes, especially if you're a newer yoga student or participant, having an instructor or a therapist who has experience and can help, provide some ideas of like, oh, well, maybe try doing this, and different ways to, offer props or tools, I think can also be helpful. And so there's certainly a number of trainings specific to adaptive yoga, accessible yoga that are out there now, which is really exciting. And I think actually Yoga Alliance has recently redone some of their requirements for their schools. And I think, looking into more of that kind of work to be included in any 200-hour teacher training, which I think is really important.
Yeah, and I was going to mention Yoga Alliance as well, for anyone interested in, learning about pursuing teacher training or certifications. That's what we suggest as a starting point for exploring. There's lots of different options for that. And we just received a question too coming in from Catherine. She is asking if there are ways that she as a yoga teacher should ask new students about their disability, abilities, injury, or other limitations. Amy B., would you have any suggestions, at least from your own experience, practicing in different studios, how you prefer to communicate about your disability?
Yeah, so one of the things I kind of learned really early on, just on my side, the disabled side, was to never assume that when you go into a place that all of the yoga instructors are going to know how to deal with somebody with a disability. So what I started doing fairly early on was calling ahead saying, hey, I just wanted to let you know that I'm going to be in your class tonight, and I have, a T4 level injury of, I'm paraplegic and I don't stand, and I wanted to know, like, if there's anybody, if I'm going to be by myself, is there anybody there who might be able to assist me a little bit? Because that's going to weigh heavily on whether or not I'm going to be able to get down into the floor and do some of the class in the floor, or if I'm going to prefer to just stay in my chair and say, hey, do you happen to have an office chair or something else that I could use to prop my feet up? So for the person doing yoga, it's important to let them know you're going to be coming to the class. And it's the same way on the opposite side. I think that most all of us in the disabled world, I mean, we're kind of open to someone saying, hey, you do have a disability. Do you mind giving me a little bit of an idea of what you've got going on? Because obviously there's a huge difference between what my disability is versus Keith. He can probably do almost anything you ask him to, whereas I'm a weeble wobble, and I also am very pressure sore prone, so I know that I'm going to have extra special cushioning on the floor. A yoga mat's not going to cut it for me. I'm going to need a bit more security and support for my sit bones while I'm down there on the floor. So those are things for them to look at and look into.
Yeah, so communication is definitely key, and being proactive, like you said, giving them a call beforehand or seeing what they have available. Does anyone have anything else to add on that topic, or maybe suggestions on resources where a yoga teacher could go to learn more about certain disabilities and how a yoga practice may be modified for them?
I can jump in.
I don't have any. I don't have any resources, but just to piggyback on what everyone's saying as far as communication goes, it's really important to be transparent. Whether someone calls ahead or whether someone just shows up as an instructor, you're holding space, and it's very important to be accommodating, and regardless of what the challenge of the individuals who are taking part in your class, it's just being transparent and being accommodating. I'll give an example. I was leading a class with a Marine who happened to he had bilateral amputations right below the hip. And I asked him, I mean, granted, we worked together, so he was a new employee, and I asked him, without anyone hearing me or without anyone being around, I think he arrived early, so I was able to ask him, I make some references as far as reaching through your toes. Will that bother you? Do you need me to modify that? So really, communication is the biggest piece to it.
If I could just add on that, or add to that, like everyone's saying, communication is very important. Don't be scared to ask those questions. Like Amy said, a lot of us, you can see it. So, we're pretty open to people addressing it. It happens all the time, even just out on the street. So, yeah, feel free to ask, because that actually is a little more comforting than someone just assuming what your capabilities or limitations are.
I agree completely with that, Keith. We have people sign a kind of a liability waiver, which I think most studios, well, actually all studios should be doing. And there's a little bit of medical history on that, but if I have a new student come in, I'll just take them off to the side, and I'll have what they filled out, and then I'll just say, tell me what I need to know about you. And most of the time, I may have that they have a T4 spinal cord injury on the sheet, but when I sit them down, they're going to say, I'm healing from a pressure sore, or I broke my leg last year when I was doing yoga, and now I'm really nervous, or whatever. Those are the things as a teacher I really want to know about the students that are coming to see me, not just a diagnosis. I want to know about you. And so I'll just take them aside and say, tell me what I need to know to teach you. And that usually starts a really nice conversation. And then we both feel a little more comfortable about moving into the yoga space together.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Amy. I do. I have a similar approach, checking in with folks as they're coming in, new people, or even students who maybe been coming for a little while and something new might be going on. And then I think another important thing that I always keep in my mind is like, as a yoga instructor, yoga therapist in training is my scope, and like, what can I actually do as the provider, or when, you know, when should I refer out for something if somebody's coming in with some things happening that I really am not 100% sure might be contraindicated or not, you know, knowing when to say, well, hey, you know, there's this, you know, Amy is this other great PT and yoga instructor who has a class, you know, maybe you can try her class first. So kind of, I think, knowing when, especially I think as new teachers, knowing when, like, you might want to recommend somebody take a class with a more experienced instructor, if that makes sense.
And you know, hinging on that too, Alison, is knowing, you know, if there's anything that you really need to know about, like they can't bring their arms over their head because they had a cardiac procedure or something like that, you know, are there any precautions that your healthcare provider told you about? I always want to know that too, for safety.
Yeah, all good points there on communication, and you know, seeing that communication is important, not just at the outset, but also ongoing. That may be throughout the time that you teach them, or during a class, being open and available and ready to ask questions too. I know we got some specific questions regarding adaptations for yoga. For example, practicing seated versus standing, having feet on the floor versus on a footrest if you're using a chair. Do any of you all have some insight on that, as far as maybe your personal practice? I don't know, Amy B, if this is something you want to speak to, or is this one of those things where there's no single answer really? It may just depend on the individual working through it with their teacher.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that there's no single answer. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. It's whatever is comfortable for you. And it's been kind of funny, because for me, COVID has changed my whole yoga experience, because I've been doing it in my bed with Zoom. Move United has had several yoga classes, and I typed in, I was like, hey, can I do this from my bed? Is that kosher? Is that all right? It is amazing, because I don't have to worry about sores, and you know, I have a queen size bed, so I can sprawl out in 50 different directions and not, you know, I'm not going to fall off. And so there's a lot of safety, and it's just made my yoga experience, especially during these trying times, where you know, you can relax, and then as soon as the class is over and say you want to relax and breathe and do a little bit more, well, class is over and you don't have to get up and get out now. You can just keep laying there and really get deeper into your meditation. So some of the great things that have come out of the COVID pandemic for me is my meditation practice has gotten maybe to a little bit of a higher level. So, I mean, in you know, everything's different for everybody. I do like to sit on the floor because it is a little bit more freeing, but I know that my balance is compromised. So I always take a step stool in with me. And I use the step stool as how I get down to the floor. And then if I can't lean, I can't sit up and put my arms above my head without leaning back on something. I lean back on that my step stool. So, you know, we just trial and error is going to, and there's no right way or wrong way, and you're not competing with anybody. It's just all about you, what you're comfortable doing. No one's looking at you really. If they are, you know, well, then they're probably super amazed at how wonderful you're doing over there, or that you got into a pose they couldn't even get into, and they're curious, how in the heck did she do that? I can't even do that. So yeah, it's just so much, it's so fun and so good for you in so many ways.
Well,
if I could just interject a little bit there, just kind of piggybacking what Amy said, you know, there's no right or wrong way. It's yoga and meditation is a very personal thing, I've learned. And around where I live in a very active place where there's not a ton of people with disabilities. And so there's not a ton of yoga options for people with disabilities. So I'll go into a standard yoga class and if I can't do a pose, I might either make a slight adjustment so that I'm getting close to it, or I'll just go into something like Happy Baby or something like that. That's gonna benefit me a little bit more than trying to squat down and sit on the back of my heels, which I just cannot do with a prosthetic. So it's very personal, and there's no right or wrong way. It's just a practice. So I don't ever consider really anyone a master per se, because we're all practicing and we're all learning together.
No, that's a really good point. And I think something that yoga helps teach us too is to tune in. And part of tuning in, like you're saying, during a class, if something isn't working for you, being able to do something else that suits you better. I think that's really good advice for anyone that's experimenting with this. Now I want to shift gears to talk a little bit about trauma-informed yoga, and we had one question come in from Kristen. She's asking for suggested yoga techniques that help with effects of trauma on the body, or if any of you might suggest any trauma-related yoga resources. John, could I have you chime in on that to start us off?
Sure. As far as resources go, I would suggest the Veterans Yoga Project. There's a lot of different programs. The Veterans Yoga Project has a lot of resources. BYP.org, if I'm not mistaken, or it's Veterans Yoga Project, oneword.org. They have a lot of resources. As far as trauma-informed techniques, Yoga Nidra is amazing. It's amazing. And trauma-informed yoga, it also applies to Keith and several others made a good point that there's no one way. There's no one way. And even with trauma-informed, I just caught myself and said, Yoga Nidra is amazing. However, different people may have a different response. With most of my classes are very gentle. I'm very mindful not to do any physical adjustments. I don't do any physical adjustments. Whatever posture that I'm leading, I demonstrate, I practice, and what that does is it takes away any triggering them. If there is a rapport and I'm able to maybe demonstrate a posture next to them so they can make the adjustments that they need to make, then I'll do that. But it's really no different than any other from an instructor's approach. There's really no different than any patient, and that is communicating, just really communicating, being very, very clear. Did I answer the question? I hope I.
Yes, all good points. And I also included the link for Veterans Yoga Project for anyone looking to learn more about that. I know they're offering a number of online classes for people to practice, and they also do teacher training as well. Alison, is there anything that you might add as this pertains to veterans?
Yeah, I would agree with John. I think there's a lot of great resources out there and training. Veterans Yoga Project was one of them. There's a number of other organizations out there, Connected Warriors, Warriors at Ease, Mindful Yoga Therapy, Exalted Warriors. So I think there's a lot of different groups. And again, I think a lot of different teacher trainings that are starting to incorporate a little bit more of that component into their trainings, which is great. And I think in terms of specific yogic tools, again, as John said and others have said, I think a lot of that probably depends on the individual. But I have found, Yoga Nidra or like an I Rest Yoga Nidra might work for one individual. Another type of meditation might work for somebody else. There's different kinds of breathing practices, I think, that can help, just kind of calm the nervous system down. And sometimes it's really, and I think Amy, you're talking a little bit about this before, is that like mind-body connection and kind of, reuniting individuals with their mind, their body. And there's so many different yoga practices that can help with that. I don't know that I could name just one sort of magic, you know, tool that's going to do that, because I do really think it's individualized based on the person. But I think there is so much that yoga can offer for individuals who have, you know, experienced different types of trauma.
And I know Amy S. in Mind Body Solutions mission statement, it says about helping people with trauma, loss, and disability through yoga. And some of your practices for trauma-informed yoga may vary or be a little bit different than some of these mainstream trauma-informed practices. Or I don't know if I'm conveying that accurately, but can you talk a little bit more about what, if you can, in a nutshell, kind of that philosophy, or more specifically around touch and why that is important?
Well, yeah, I mean, we have a slightly different perspective. I think at the end of the day, we all know any yoga practice that's working to help people come home to their body is, you know, any way you can help people who are very, very different, as we've all been saying. We at Mind Body Solutions, we tend to focus not quite so much on that trauma-informed model. We use more of a healing-centered model, I would say. You know, believing in the resilience of the people who are in front of us, and maybe not paying quite as much attention during our classes to controlling the environment, like where the door is or how the lights are, or something like that, which all of which for certain a certain group of people with trauma is very, very important. So I would never say don't do that. But I think we focus more on creating the conditions of safety, and sometimes creating the conditions of safety in a yoga class can be done in different ways, but using the body to help our students recognize a sense of boundary. And maybe that boundary is sitting with their back against the wall, or maybe it's helping them begin to receive gentle awareness through the back body. And again, this is a longer conversation, but that might be helping people become comfortable in a chest opening position where they feel safe and supported. And then once we get there, then we want to build strength underneath that support. And so we might transition somebody to doing standing poses. So they're feeling supported, they're feeling the conditions of safety, and then we're building strength under that. And in that way, really focusing and believing in the resilience of the people that we're working with. It's slightly different than a trauma-informed model, and there's nothing wrong with a trauma-informed model. I'm just saying it's just another way. I think, you know, we're all climbing the mountain, and it's just a different way up that path, I should say. I don't know how much more you want me to go into it right now.
No, I think that's good, and for people wanting to look into it further, you know, they know where to find you. And I think it's important, you know, just like when we're talking about different setups and things, realizing that it's like a process of learning what works. So there's not always that one easy solution, though that would be really nice. That's how our brains work. We just want everything to fit in a box where it belongs. So I want to go back to our talk about barriers to yoga, or like where there's misconceptions and that may deter people from getting involved. And I want to invite each of you, or you know, whoever wants to chime in here, if you can identify one of these barriers or misconceptions, and if you have any suggestions for strategies to help overcome these barriers.
Sorry, I jumped in there. When I first started, I didn't see the results that I wanted right off the bat. And I don't think that goals and that kind of stuff are bad, but I think my intention was that I would be seeing dramatic results right off the bat. And kind of getting away from that, I realized like I was really judging my practice, and I really was judging my meditation practice, and I wasn't truly open to receive the true benefits of it. And so I pushed away at first and then came back to it later. And, you know, having goals and that kind of stuff, that's great. But understanding that every day is going to be a little bit different. Every practice is going to be a little bit different, and understanding that like over time, if you give it time and you don't, I guess, judge it so much, you'll start to see those results that you really do want to see. But it does take practice, and it takes time, and it takes effort. And again, it's very personal. So what works for me might not work for Amy, or might not work for Alison or John or anybody. And so just understanding that it's truly within myself to back away from the judgment side of everything and just be open to receive.
Yeah, I think that especially for a competitive athlete, that's a really difficult realization, but one that, you know, obviously in your experience, you were able to realize that at a poignant time in your career. And I think that as we can get the word out to our young and up and coming athletes too, this is a seed that can be planted earlier and help them succeed.
I know for myself, sorry, I was going to just quickly say that I went in because I didn't know a single thing about yoga. All I thought was, this is stretching. That's all we're going to be doing. And I left with a, you know, and now I have just so much of a greater appreciation for body mindfulness and the breathing techniques that have helped me along the way. I can be in a match losing and, you know, and maybe even be fairly aware that the person that I'm playing is extremely better than I am, and I am going to lose this match. But if I can just calm myself and breathe, then I might be able to then also say, you know what, okay, so a win isn't going to probably happen here. What will I win at? What am I going to achieve? Instead of constantly always having the goal of winning, finding all the other things that mean that you're winning at life. So being able to breathe, or even an injury. Sometimes you can be hurt and you can breathe yourself into feeling a bit better and be able to go out and finish or do what it is that you're doing. So I went in thinking stretching, and I came out with a complete different realization of what yoga truly is.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Definitely coming in with an open mind is important, so that you can realize that it's more than what you may have expected. And I think, Alison, are you good, or did you need to?
Yeah, I'm good. And actually, if I could just piggyback on that, Amy, what you were saying about the yoga helping you win at life, I just smiled a little bit, because like you, I also came into yoga thinking it was a stretching or just these, you know, physical postures to help, you know, keep me flexible and things like that. And I came away with so much more, where I feel like on a daily basis, I don't necessarily do the physical practice, but the breathing practices have helped me with, you know, work relationships or duties, or, you know, home relationships and things. I think just being able to take that, you know, kind of learning how to take that step back, pause, take a few breaths. And I can't remember who mentioned this. Maybe it was you, Keith, about, you know, being able to kind of respond rather than react to things. And so I think that was a big barrier going into it, was thinking it's this one thing, and then just learning afterwards there's so much more to it. And my daily practice usually is more around, you know, breathing and meditation.
And I know we're coming up on 1 hour here, so I know we may have some folks that are departing, but our panelists have agreed to stick around and answer a couple more questions. But if you are heading out, make sure that you complete our feedback survey. We'll drop that in the chat box for you. And I also wanted, so all of our panelists are meeting each other for the first time today. And I wanted to invite you all to, if you would like to ask one another a question, this would be a great time to do that. If you're curious about anyone else's experience or work in this space. I just wanted to invite just a conversation amongst you all.
I have a question for Alison, if you've got the time, Alison, just about the integrative movement at the VA. Sounds fascinating, and maybe just a little tiny bit of history of what brought the VA to the point of wanting to create this integrative care model, and what do you see are the strong points, and where does it still have to go?
Yeah, well, I feel like that could be a whole webinar in and of itself, but I'm happy to start here a little bit. So I think it's definitely been sort of, work in progress. The office that I work for has been around since 2011, and really, with that idea from VA leadership, thinking about how we need to kind of shift and transform. And I think we also talk about some of the turning point with this. Our office has been working on this model, this whole health system for a long time, but there was sort of convergence in a way when, we saw a lot of uptick with opioids, things like that happening. The Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act legislation of 2016, which has the mandates on VA to expand integrative health as well as pilot this. So it was like we were kind of already working on it, but then, we had some high up requests or, mandates to do some of this work. So I think that really kind of helped put us over the edge there a little bit in terms of, getting over the hump. I think we're seeing some great results, and maybe I can share with Julianne some links that could be shared with everyone. That we had a report come out recently on what we call our whole health system flagship site. So that's under the CARE legislation, we had to implement no fewer than 15 pilot sites expanding integrative health. We knew that it wouldn't work to just have, yoga here, acupuncture here. It had to be in this system, this transformed system, for that really to work. And so we have 18 flagship sites, and we have 18 because we have 18 veteran integrated service networks, or sort of regions in the VA, if you're familiar with that. So we have one flagship site for each of those VISNs. And the preliminary data report that came out a little while back, I think in February, has some really promising results, which is really exciting. I think also veteran demand, veterans who are in our system have been asking for some of these approaches, either directly at the medical center or perhaps, to their Congress people, I think really that demand, and then, the qualitative data, the testimonials, I think has been really huge. And then I think also another shift, it helps having champions in the field. So when we have VA employees who are really, kind of grassroots, like from the facility level, like John at Bedford, they're doing such amazing work there. So having folks in the field who are really excited about this, who are trained up in different modalities, who are working with their leadership locally to get these things rolling. And then another big piece, and then I'll stop, but it's also the community partners. So I think working with other organizations, I think there's such a huge demand for, a whole health system for integrative health, both in the VA and outside the VA. VA certainly can't do everything on its own. So I think working with community partners, working with volunteers, because veterans are not only at the VA Medical Center, so much of their time in life is outside of the walls of the VA. So really, working with others, coming onto webinars like this, meeting all of you panelists. I have so many questions for all of you, so I'm hoping to connect with you all, but just kind of, that idea. And I think John mentioned this, like the coming together, right? The unity, I think, around yoga speaks to me so much in that sense as well, and kind of looking at that whole picture. So I hope that kind of answers your question a little bit, and again, I'm happy to talk much more and to share resources with anyone.
Yeah, we'll definitely include those resources, Alison, in our wrap-up email tomorrow. I know for me, I'm a regular reader of the VA blog, and I've really liked the whole health series. That has been awesome, especially during this time of COVID. Lots of good resources and things to try. So, did you want to pitch a question to one of our other panelists, Alison, or? Or anyone else?
Oh,
wanna
I
jump
feel
in?
like, yeah, I feel like I have so many. I wouldn't even know where to start. I guess maybe, you know, Keith and Amy, you know, maybe helping us kind of understand, like, are there other things that we could be thinking about, like John and I in VA in terms of, you know, yoga, mind-body interventions, and then also Amy, I know you're Amy Samson, you're not in VA, but you also work with a variety of veterans, I'm sure, yourself. So I guess just any, you know, any things that we're not thinking about, any things that we should be thinking about, it'd be great to hear a little bit from you two.
I'll jump in there. You know, something that comes across a lot, especially on the Semper Fi Fund side of things, is the caretakers. You know, for us, we try to integrate the caretakers as much as possible, as well as not just our service members, but the people that are directly dealing with them day in and day out. I don't know if you guys do work with the caretakers. We have a program that offers some mindfulness retreats and that kind of stuff, but that would be huge, just from what I've understood from having these conversations with also not just the service members, but their caretakers as well. As you know, they're under tremendous amount of stress trying to deal with everyday life sometimes. So I don't know if you guys do or not, but that's, if I could throw anything out there, that would be something.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we could always do more. I think there are some things that we have a robust caregiver program, but I think making sure that we are, you know, continuing to provide them with all of this as well. Thanks, Keith.
Yeah, what I would have to say would be really along the same lines too. Not just caregivers and helping them out, but getting families involved. You know, the families that play together stay together. So if you can get the entire family involved, they're all going to grow and heal together. So there's nothing but benefit there.
Yeah, thank you. That's so important. Oh, go ahead.
I think the only thing I would add, because I agree completely with the caregivers, that's absolutely vital. And I love the idea of partnering with organizations in the community. So I think strengthening and continuing to enhance those community partnerships. So, you know, at the end of the day, people have multiple community points of access where they have support. And, you know, that allowing them and helping them return to community functioning or function well in the community. So I think enhancing all those community partnerships it's really important.
Maybe I could just throw one more thing out there.
Sure.
Kind of like yoga and meditation practices, you know, there's no one size fits all. So even though, you know, I'm a BK, below knee amputee, what works for me just across the board, whether it's practicing yoga or whether it's you know, a prosthetic fit or a certain type of device, it's never a one size fits all. And I'm sure you guys already know this and understand this, but I always like to emphasize that every person, every disability is slightly different. And, you know, understanding that and the willingness to work with each individual on that individual basis is so important.
Yeah, absolutely, Keith. And that's, I think, what we're striving for with this whole health system, right? Really working with the individual veteran, pairing them up potentially with a coach or a partner, working through their personal health inventory, creating a health plan, and providing some of these skills. So potentially, you know, learning how to do yoga at home or meditation. So yeah, 100% with you on that. I think that's a really, and it's always great to be reminded, as much as we think we all, you know or understand that. I think we need to remember that every single day, every single interaction. So thank you.
Great. And as we shift gears and kind of wind down to our last few minutes of today's discussion, I just want to go back to a point that Amy B raised early on, and about how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected her practice, and in some ways in positive ways. And I'm just curious to hear your insights on, how this has really fueled an at-home practice, or made yoga accessible in ways that it hasn't been before. I know we've seen a huge demand through the hashtag Adapt at Home initiative that we're running with Move United. We've hosted and curated over 600 different virtual activities since this lockdown period. And I'm really glad to say, I'm just a little biased, but really glad to say a good portion of that has been like yoga, mindfulness activities, meditation. So there's definitely an appetite for this. Do you all have any thoughts on, what could this look like a year from now? Is this something temporary in response to what we're in, or do you think this can really shape things, either personally for yourself or thinking bigger than that? Any thoughts you have on that?
Yeah. Oh,
Go ahead, Alison. Go ahead.
I think we all were trying to say something at the same time. I was just going to say, at least my experience has been, I think, we had been building up a tele-whole health, as we call it, program in VA, including tele-yoga. So we had a number of sites that were already doing this through our internal VA Video Connect with veterans at their homes, especially helpful for folks who maybe live where it's harder to get in for various reasons. I definitely think that the pandemic is shaping, kind of reshaping healthcare in a way, or a lot of different systems, not just the healthcare system. And so I foresee, especially, as Amy was saying, it's really nice to be able to, take a yoga class in my pajamas if I want now, and have that, that flexibility to do that. And so I think there's going to be the demand of the consumer or the participant. And then also I think it's been helpful to be able to do that. And, for example, in VA, I'm sure John can relate to this, where space is often an issue. So I think having the ability to do some of this virtually can be very helpful as space is being shifted for, in this case, COVID-related activities, or just in general. I think the virtual yoga is definitely here to stay.
I'm seeing nodding heads. Do we all agree, or is any other thoughts or challenge to that?
We generally do a lot of in-person camps and clinics on the Semper Fi Fund side of things, but everything has gone virtual. We're in a complete holding pattern. So we do 2 yoga classes a week. We have a cycling group, a walking, running, multiple groups that have gone to this virtual world to keep everyone connected and practicing whatever they're into practicing.
And John, you had something to add? Do we still have you, John?
Yeah, I have to agree with Alison as well. I think virtual yoga is here to stay. I think that it goes beyond the VA with all this. Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
How about now?
You're good. Keep going.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I see, yeah. Oh, okay, you can hear me. Sorry about that. I do think virtual yoga is up here to stay, but I also moving beyond the VA allows for us to really take ownership of what's going on with us without stepping into studio. Prepares us to deal with what's going on with us, because we only have us to do our practice with. And that, I think, not only is it here to stay, but I think regardless of how things look right now, I think it's going to be transformative in the way that we deal with each other when we are able to go back to the studio and do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's clear to see this is definitely shaping some things in the industry and in a lot of ways for the better. And it's really important, as we've said over and over on today's discussion, that people are still central to this. Communication is very central. So we all have a role to play in making yoga inclusive and accessible, whether you're a yoga teacher or you're practicing alongside someone. Just think about what steps you're taking to be inclusive and helping others access yoga. So again, I want to thank today's panelists for joining us today. You all have been a fantastic group. I'll be sending a follow-up email tomorrow mentioning some resources that were mentioned on the webinar today. And I also want to invite everyone to take a few moments to complete our survey when we close out. And if you haven't done so already, check out #AdaptAtHome. Show us how you're doing yoga at home. Get involved in some virtual classes and spread the love. I think we can keep pushing it out there and combining all our efforts will really make a difference in that. So thank you all. And this concludes our Yoga and Disability webinar series. If you'd like to see more content like this, again, make sure to fill out your survey and let us know.